164. The Disastrous War. Chalcedon Report number 369, April 1996. Perhaps the greatest and most tragic disaster in the history of the United States is the Civil War, or the war between the states. The whole country is still paying for that evil war. It is still difficult to speak or write about it without angering someone, blacks, northerners, or southerners. A few years ago, I followed a black speaker at a conference who demanded reparations for all blacks by American whites. I had first met that young man after his graduation, and he then spoke excellent English. At this conference, he spoke black English. I said that, as one born of immigrant parents who only reached the United States at the end of 1915, I felt no guilt whatsoever. Speaking for my wife, a descendant of Scots who came here early in the colonial era, members of her family and countless other white families gave their lives in that war to free the blacks. What guilt did they have? The guilt was his for such immoral premises. That man was not pleased. I have always been reluctant to argue over that unpleasant subject, but unwilling to be silent when there is a need to speak. Told Northerners that it was less a moral concern and more economic and sectional hatred that governed the North. The rhetoric of a sizable minority, the abolitionists, was anti-Christian and Unitarian. They were intensely interested in destroying the South, and their moral claims were questionable. The Southerners were also ready to allow, as did the Northerners, the extremists and hotheads to lead the way into an unrealistic war. The war came when the churches were at a low ebb theologically, although the South saw a major revival among the troops during the war. While the South was staunchly Christian, its leaders, especially secessionists, were not. Some significant facts must be remembered about the South. Savage called attention to a neglected fact. Of the 130 anti-slavery societies organized in the country, more than two-thirds were in the South. Henry Savage Jr., Seeds of Time, The Background of Southern Thinking, New York, 1959, page 62. There were good reasons for this. First, slavery was a very present fact to all Southerners. Second, Puritan faith had then centred in the South and, deeply resented by Unitarians, strongly influenced many Southerners, although not very many of their politicians. Third, only one of every 16 Southerners owned even a single slave. Ibid, page 82. There were various reasons for this. Some of the 15 Southerners who did not own slaves could not afford it. Others were against slavery. Other than South Carolina, Southern states favoured abolition, provided that the slaves could be repatriated somewhere, and, with some, their owners compensated. Fourth, many Southerners resented the power and pride of the slave-owning aristocracy. Even then, secession was not popular when first propounded by John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was a Northerner by education, a Yale man whose goal was to have Yale educate his sons. Charles Maurice Wiltse, John C. Calhoun, nullifier, Indianapolis, Indiana, Bob's Merrill Company, 1949, pages 31 to 32. Calhoun himself was at Yale in Timothy Dwight's day, whose faith Calhoun rejected. Calhoun would not join the church, nor profess Christianity, nor even join the Moral Society. In the classroom, his disavowal of Christianity was open. Margaret L. Coit, John C. Calhoun, American Portrait, Boston, Massachusetts, 1950, page 27. When in politics in Washington, D.C., he gave money to help build the Unitarian Church, and his name is found among the original members. Although he attended his wife's Episcopal church when in the South, he bluntly announced on one occasion, "Unitarianism is the only true faith and will ultimately prevail over the world." Ibid, page 508. In his last days, with an echo of his childhood Calvinism, Calhoun spoke of his unshaken reliance upon the providence of God. Ibid, page 509, but not of Jesus Christ. Calhoun's perspective was important. More than a few prominent Southerners sought their education in New England colleges, which were openly or tacitly Unitarian. The Timothy Dwights of the early years could not stem the tide. Unitarian and transcendentalist thinking was either Hegelian or shared common roots with Hegel. Such thinking represented a major intellectual revolution in Europe, with deep roots in the Enlightenment. Hegel best expressed the thinking of his and the previous era, namely, a radical belief in the conflict of interests. With the French Revolution, the Western world entered into the Age of Revolution, which is very much with us still. As against the biblical faith in an ultimate harmony of interests for the godly, Romans chapter 8, verse 28, this new belief was in radical conflict of interests. Thus, the way to progress was revolutionary violence, creative destruction. The resolution of problems called for conflict, and the need was for war to create peace, violence to establish justice, and hostile confrontations to resolve problems. Not moral suasion, but bitter conflict was seen as the ethical course of action. This faith marked the abolitionists in the North, most of whom were Unitarian. In the South, Unitarianism was not an organized ecclesiastical or intellectual cause as much as a tacit premise of the secessionist leaders. Calvinist leaders in that cause were, at the best, rare. However, Enlightenment premises were popular among gentlemen, and these persons were receptive to the Unitarian developments thereof. The secessionist leaders were not Calvinists, and they did share in the growing and tacit Unitarianism of the leaders of the day. Those men, North and South, who were not Christian, were not thereby neutral, but rather were deeply influenced by common media that prevailed in all of the United States. That media represented the culture of Enlightenment humanism. The philosophy of the modern era began with Descartes, whose cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was the starting point of philosophical inquiry. The Cartesian premise at once created a division in man's perspective between body and soul, between perceptions and reality, and between the inner and the outer worlds, so that the concern was to bridge two realms. With Kant, the real world became the realm of the mind, and reality was what the philosophical mind declared it to be. Thus, the real world was not the creation of God, but the creation of the philosopher's mind. It followed, then, that the rational is the real. But what if some refuse to recognize that reality is what they define as real? What if, as with the abolitionists, reality is human freedom for all? Or if adherents of slavery see it as a condition inherent to slavery, what happens then? Without God and his law, man's recourse is to himself, or to his creature, the state. Reality is then not God, nor his created order and his law. It is, instead, what man declares is right. The new reality is man's declared law, and the non-Christians in both North and South had their own vision of the right and the real. God was not in their picture. To read through the edition of John C. Calhoun's works in the Crowley edition, 1851 to 1856, or the more recent and more extensive collection by W. Edwin Hemphill, is a chilling experience. There is no evidence of Christian thinking. In the North, the abolitionists wanted conflict, not resolution. Slavery could have been abolished had the North been ready to take practical steps, such as compensating the slave owners and some kind of plan for the future of the slaves. The abolitionists, however, wanted conflict, as did the secessionists by 1860. Lincoln, without war, would have been a stalemated president with a hostile Congress in power. The demand in the radical circles, both North and South, was for conflict as a solution. Although Scott has pointed out that, at about the same time, many countries with a higher percentage of slaves freed them all peaceably, only the United States had a war over the matter. In the United States, more than anywhere else, the common man was reasonably well informed and attuned to intellectual trends. In a travel essay written for a French magazine on his return from the United States, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, of Frontier, Michigan, "When you leave the main roads, you force your way down barely trodden paths. Finally, you see a field cleared, a cabin made from half-shaped tree trunks, admitting the light through one narrow window only. You think you have at last reached the home of the American peasant. Mistake. You make your way into this cabin that seems the asylum of all wretchedness, but the owner of the place is dressed in the same clothes as yours, and he speaks the language of towns. On his rough table are books and newspapers. He himself is anxious to know exactly what is happening in old Europe and asks you to tell him what has most struck you in his country. One might think one was meeting a rich landowner who had come to spend just a few nights in a hunting lodge." This was in 1831. One can say that de Tocqueville found a superior settlement without invalidating his point that the Americans in the most remote areas were not peasants, but citizens of the Western world. This made them more readily susceptible to currents of thought than were rural peoples in Europe. There was another factor. The War of Independence had been a legal factor. The American War of Independence had been a legal break. The colonies were not under Parliament, but under the Crown. They were chartered colonies. Under law, the agents of the Crown, held by the ailing George III, were violating the charters and placing the colonies under Parliament. King George III was King of England, King of Scotland, King of New York, King of Massachusetts, and so on, all separate realms. Their powers were subverted, and the colonies were subjected to an armed invasion by Parliament. In 1863, a monthly journal, The Old Guard, began publication in New York, dedicated to the defense, in effect, of secession. The Old Guard cited publications of the 1776 era as justification for 1860 and secession, and tellingly so. At the same time, however, a subtle shift had taken place. The War of Independence had become known as the American Revolution. Jacobinism flourished in the United States with the French Revolution, especially in democratic circles. A legally faithful course of severance became confused with revolution. Alexander H. Stephens, the Confederate Vice President, in his great constitutional view of the late war between the states, defined the legalities of the war. But it was not Stephens who precipitated the war, but men like Edmund Ruffin, known as a firebrand. The roots of that war are with us still. North, south, east and west. The belief in the conflict of interest is very great, and it still predisposes Americans to senseless divisions. The conflict of interests concept is born of a worldview which is implicitly evolutionary, posits the struggle for survival, and sees that struggle as inherent to life, that is, as metaphysical rather than moral, although the struggle can borrow moral coloration. The Calvinistic insistence on the moral antithesis seeks its resolution in conversion, in a new creation. The conflict of interest belief seeks its, quote, resolution, end quote, in the obliteration of the opponent. It has led to the doctrine of total war in the military sphere and elsewhere. Not surprisingly, the modern military strategy of total war began in the so-called Civil War with men like Quantrill in the south, a guerrilla, and General Sherman in the north. Its history is a grim one.